Hi, thank you so much for the engagement on my previous videos. It kind of scared me actually. So I took a break to focus on some university work and refocus. So now that I'm back, consciousness. Yes, I gotta be honest and say that even though I was very interested in making a video about this, I had no idea where to start with it because I don't quite know where this conversation about consciousness even is at the moment on a larger scale, if there is a conversation at a larger scale even. I've been reading A Case Against Reality by Donald Hoffman, which disappointed me, but in which there is this idea that as living beings we only see reality as an interface related to our development and reproduction, in the sense that an apple, for example, is not objectively speaking an apple, but something that helps us survive and therefore helps us pass on our genes. And I would agree to this to some extent, except for the fact that I can't quite support this claim of objective reality as being something that the mind simplifies. The fact that we've established models and patterns of this subjective reality down to the level of 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, as Hoffman highlights, is nice, but matter of fact is that in spite of how deep or far we reach into this so-called objective reality, we will not know what it is, but only the patterns it entails, which I'm perfectly fine with correlating, because that's why I'm saying, is there a difference between what something functions as, meaning the patterns it entails, and the nature of that thing's existence? I would say that no, there isn't. What exists does so via its function, and furthermore what lies beyond existence is possibility, I would say. But anyway, so because we are living beings looking out for our survival and reproduction, we only operate in the realm of what is relevant to all that. So awareness or conscious experience taken linearly would signify the degree of agency and coherence oneself can manifest at any given point in time in relation to their environment. In other words, as living beings adapting to the world around us, we are conscious. The more experience of agency we can construct, the more intense this sense of consciousness will get. So then, how does consciousness develop? I find that this question is mostly nonsensical. Of course, there are some other questions we can ask starting from here, but other than that, the question, how does consciousness develop, is a wrong question. Let's take an infant, for example. Not only is it an extremely competent learner, but it's also highly organized. Newborns have innate mechanisms for face recognitions, language, and intermodal associations, such as learning to associate a voice with a face. Though actually that is not so simple either. A study from 2017 published in Nature Neuroscience used macaque monkeys, which are often used as models in scientific research because they share biological and behavioral characteristics with humans, and show that rather than having innate detection mechanisms for faces, for example, the mind has an innate mechanism for building up facial patterns and patterns per se. In summary, the study found that the monkeys who were raised without exposure to faces did not develop an ability to identify faces, but they did develop other patterns, such as for hands and other objects. This information buildup would have to develop through repeated associated exposure to said information. In other words, sensory patterns, visual, audio patterns for example, stemming from the cascading and chaotic exposures to our environment would group up into complex sensory objects such as face, hand, chair, etc. And this we can directly translate onto the mind architecture model, for which I'm still planning to make separate dedicated videos about. But essentially it labels sensory information as micro or quasi-objects. Essentially our immediate perceptual experiences would emerge from the interplay of smaller sensory patterns, which is not that new information, the experience of an apple or that of a movie stemming from these fundamental sensory ways of forming our understanding of the world. A micro-object might be, say, a spot of the color red or a tactile sensation of sorts. And the interesting thing is that red or tactile or any other ways of describing them are not necessary. Describing it as red does add to the experience over time, but when you first see the color red, for example, you don't really know that it is the color red. A baby does learn to differentiate it from the rest of the colors, but it takes a bit of time for it to matter. A baby's eyes aren't as well developed, and so in as much as they will learn to identify and sort objects based on colors, they would naturally mostly see just the bright, contrasting colors. Actually, this, along with a child's underdeveloped collection of experiences, might be why we remember our childhood as brighter than our current reality looks like. Because, technically speaking, a kid might simply not be sophisticated enough to either sense or perceive the darker, dimmer colors of an adult worldview. And anyway, at which point is the child considered conscious? I'm not talking about neuroscience because, one article published in 2013 indicates that the potential for consciousness, the traces of consciousness, are there from the time a baby is 5 months old. I'm not discussing that. I'm talking about the development of a baby's understanding of the world they live in as a place they can actively influence. I will repeat myself and say that the degree to which an organism is conscious seems to be the degree to which it can manifest itself as an active agent in its environment. The more my experience is that I am connected to and active in my environment through successful adaptation to it, the stronger this sense of consciousness becomes. Might be why when we meditate successfully, we develop a so-called higher sense of consciousness and of things being interconnected around us, or rather I should say through us. And why we would feel more relaxed because, as opposed to anxiety, sensing self-agency and coherence generates well-being. Therefore, it might also be the reason why people get offended if you imply that they were not conscious at some point in time when they should have been, like saying someone is asleep at the wheel or saying that they are just daydreaming or mad or something like that. All of these things, these insults, address a fear of losing control, of becoming passive, or in some sense unfitting in the environment. Now, there are some objections to this proposition. Firstly, subjectivity. Consciousness is often considered a subjective experience, known as qualia, and not something that can be described by this implicit ability to act or actively adapt in the environment. Secondly, non-active awareness. There might be states of consciousness where an individual is aware but not actively interacting with their environment, such as during meditation or when just looking around at a scene. Thirdly, non-human consciousness. For example, plants respond to their environment but are usually not considered conscious. Similarly, artificial intelligence can act in an environment, but whether it possesses consciousness or not is up for debate. Lastly, unconscious processing. There's evidence of unconscious processing where actions are carried out without conscious thought. If consciousness is defined by the ability to act, it might be difficult to distinguish it among conscious and unconscious actions. Now, starting with the first one, if everyone adapts in unique ways to the environment, that is related both to that individual's experience and their actions. Conceptually, you could start to imagine action as being an external representation of an individual's mind, within contextual limits, of course. The so-called same red apple that would look different for everyone is just an icon that is built in time slightly differently for everyone, varying based on each person's experiences. Our experiences are actions. We create our experience of the world as a means or prerequisite for adapting to it. So as to distinguish between active and passive agents, you can think of passive as the default quasi-experience which you might encounter, for example, when you are in the middle of a conversation and you don't know what your next words are and are just kind of waiting for them to come to you. This inability to act, or rather the sense of urgency when you seemingly cannot act, it's what I refer to as passive experience. There's nothing passive in that sense about meditation. Meditation is stable, deliberate. It's an activity that facilitates the basics of the flow of your experience. And consciousness is linear. Now, whether or not there are social or theoretical standards for determining when a baby is to be considered conscious, that is relevant, but a separate conversation. A plant, even though far less active and aware in its environment, should still be considered on the spectrum of consciousness, I think. This definition, or rather the way the definition of consciousness makes sense to me, as the degree to which something is being an active agent in one's environment, would actually suggest that everything is on the spectrum, with non-life being lower on the spectrum than actual life forms, and things like viruses and prions are somewhere in between. Now, I know some of the obvious counter-arguments related to consciousness, being a concept dependent on life. I just don't find these counter-arguments to help the conversation move other than in circles. Lastly, I like to point out the misleading concept of conscious or deliberate thought. Now, please choose what to think of in the next 5 to 10 seconds. There is nothing deliberate about thought. Predictable and stable to some degree, sure, but deliberate, no. Intention does exist in one way or another, but intentional intent doesn't. And, during the exercise you could have thought, well, I will think of X, but your actual next thought was this exact intent to think of X. So, whatever. I'll see you next time.
Wake up every day, I have some food and everything seems like it's going to be fine. Then all of a sudden shit